Zachary Taylor. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor died, and his death would go down in American history as being one of the strangest. You see, Taylor was a career soldier nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, and had survived decades of brutal military campaigns, harsh climates, and dangerous battles. Yet, while attending an Independence Day celebration on a hot July day in Washington, D.C., and eating a big bowl of raw cherries, iced milk, and large amounts of cucumber, he lost his life 5 days later. Apparently later that evening, he had developed severe stomach pains, diarrhea, and vomiting, and his condition just worsened from there. 5 days later, the president was dead at just 65 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as acute gastroenteritis, which basically means a severe stomach illness. However, his death is still very suspicious because it was so sudden and unusual. It was really hard to believe that a man as strong as Taylor could be killed by cherries and milk. The theory and suspicions of foul play lingered for over a century, but on June 17, 1991, his body was exhumed and tested for traces of poison or foul play, but no signs of arsenic poisoning were found in his remains. So it's likely Taylor really did die from contaminated food or water, which was common in 19th century Washington. William Henry Harrison. President William Henry Harrison's death is definitely one of the strangest, and it's simply because of how oddly preventable it was. You see, he was elected in 1840 at the age of 68, so he was the oldest president, at least at that time. So it was kind of a big deal, so to show that he was tough and capable, the man gave the longest inaugural address in American history. The speech lasted for almost 2 hours, and what's worse is that he was standing throughout in the extremely cold and wet Washington weather. He wasn't even wearing a hat, coat, or gloves. Well, not long after, he got very sick with pneumonia. Doctors were called in, but their medical practices at the time were basically prescribing hard for headaches and did nothing to help the man. There was even a remedy that involved the use of live snakes, but all that just made his condition worse. Surprising. It was so sad that the president, who wanted to seem strong, was literally weakened by his own bravado and bad weather. He literally died just 31 days after taking office, and will now be remembered as the shortest presidency in American history. But here's the twist. Modern historians and medical researchers believe that the cause of his death wasn't actually pneumonia, but that he may have died from typhoid fever caused by contaminated drinking water at the White House. At that time, it was very common because sewage often leaked into the water supply. However, whatever the truth is, the fact remains that his presidency was over almost before it began. Those really were the days. James A. Garfield. On July 2, 1881, President James Garfield was shot in the back as he walked past the Potomac train station by Charles Guiteau, a disgruntled, unhappy man who believed he was owed a government job. Fortunately, the bullet did not instantly kill Garfield. The wound itself might not have even been fatal because the bullet didn't hit any major organs. However, disaster still struck because the doctors treating him seriously lacked proper medical procedure. Apparently, doctors in the 1880s didn't believe in germ theory, so none of them washed their hands or even tried to use sterilized tools. They just repeatedly poked and prodded the man with hands and tools full of dirt and germs. They even employed the use of a metal detector whose aim was to try and find the bullet, but the only thing their help did was cause massive infections. The man was gradually getting sicker and suffered horribly for nearly 3 months. He developed several pus-filled abscesses, lost over 100 pounds, and ate all sorts of really disgusting meals just to be kept alive. What makes this whole ordeal worse is that new medical practices like antiseptics were already popular in Europe, so he was basically just getting tortured by his own medical team. Finally, on September 19, 1881, the man finally died. The irony? He wasn't killed by the assassin, but by his doctors. Abraham Lincoln. People often remember Abraham Lincoln as the first president to ever successfully get assassinated. And this was because assassinating a president was a very strange and unheard of thing at the time. But on April 14, 1865, just days after the Civil War ended, this was precisely what happened. You see, Lincoln had decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., which was a pretty bad decision because he had been receiving threats for years. What's worse, he went to the public theater with very minimal protection for a president. In fact, the man who assassinated him was a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth. He was literally a celebrity at the time and had used his insider knowledge of the area to sneak into Lincoln's box and shoot him in the back of the head. The strangest part was how easy it was for a well-known actor to easily sneak in and assassinate the president during a play in front of millions of people. The bullet didn't even kill him immediately, and he was carried across the street to be a boarding house where doctors tried to save him. He lingered for hours, slipping in and out of consciousness before finally kicking the bucket the next morning on April 15th. The whole ordeal, from getting murdered in public to the strange coincidences, makes his death very unforgettable in American history. Franklin Pierce. After leaving the White House in 1857, Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, life spiraled downhill into a very disgraceful mess. Unlike many of his predecessors who had died from war wounds or assassinations, Pierce's end was tied directly to his long battle with alcohol. Firstly, the man had already experienced a lot of deep personal tragedies and baggage. The most notable was the untimely death of his 3 children. In fact, his youngest son was brutally killed in a gruesome train accident just weeks before Pierce's inauguration. Then, throughout the entire presidency, he was faced with the threat of civil war, political manipulations, and continuous fights and protests. Safe to say, Pierce was broken in spirit and turned heavily to alcohol for solace. He drank so much that he became one of the first presidents openly described as struggling with alcoholism. So by the time he clocked 60, his health was a huge mess. He started suffering from cirrhosis of the liver, a deadly condition caused by years of heavy drinking. Finally, in October 1869, his body shut down. He suddenly just collapsed and died in Concord, New Hampshire, at just 64 years old. His death was so strange because he was the first president that didn't die as an image of leadership and strength, but as a largely forgotten and pitied president. Pierce is literally remembered more for drinking himself to death than for his presidency. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. When we talk about strange presidential deaths, none top the cosmic timing of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. These 2 men weren't just presidents, but were a literal American experiment. Firstly, Adams held the position of the 2nd U.S. president, while Jefferson held the position of the 3rd. However, they weren't exactly the best of friends. You could even go as far as calling them rivals, but as the years went by, the 2 agreed on some sort of friendship and together represented the intellectual backbone of the Revolution. Their shared interest led to a strong friendship that lasted for years and would even transcend to their deaths. Both men died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Yes, they died on the golden jubilee of the very document they had poured their energy into creating and defending. The coincidence doesn't end here, because while 90-year-old Adams was in Massachusetts, sick and frail, 83-year-old Jefferson was equally bedridden and dying in Virginia. His health had been getting worse since 1818, when he visited a spa to find relief for his rheumatism. He also suffered from swollen legs, painful joints, fatigue, a fractured left wrist, a boil on his jaw, increasing deafness, and unspecified illnesses, and they just kept getting worse. The weirdest part is that these 2 men didn't even know of each other's condition. Jefferson, always the idealist, seemed determined to make it and reportedly kept asking if it was the 4th of July yet. He finally passed away in the early hours of July 4th. A couple hours later, Adams gave up the ghost too, but his final words would forever be etched in history. According to witnesses, he said Thomas Jefferson still survives, but in reality, Jefferson had already died earlier that day. It was disturbingly poetic, and the timing of the both of them dying on the exact 50th Independence Day made it extremely strange. James Monroe. Revolutionary War hero, founding father, president during the era of good feelings, James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States, was known by a lot of names and lived quite a dramatic life. However, the strangeness of his death was what made his presidential tenure stand out in history. Monroe also strangely died on July 4th, 1831, which was already causing a lot of stir because two other U.S. presidents, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, had died exactly 5 years earlier on that day. These three presidents were all deeply tied to the founding of the country, so dying on the exact same day seemed strangely patriotic. Their deaths almost felt supernatural, as if the men who shaped the nation had timed their exits with symbolic precision. In fact, newspapers at the time called it the Hand of Providence. Plus, after his presidency, Monroe moved in with his daughter in New York because he was deeply in debt. He had spent much of his personal fortune during his career in public service, and Congress refused to fully reimburse him, which was something that was embarrassingly common for ex-presidents back then. However, the actual cause of his death was tuberculosis, because after years of struggling, he was extremely weak and suffering. On the morning of July 4th, while church bells and cannons fired in celebration of America's 55th Independence Day, Monroe was taking his final breaths. Today, historians literally point to this and call it the July 4th presidential curse, and it has remained one of the strangest quirks in American history. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the 7th U.S. president, and you could well say that this man was practically living on borrowed time for a very long time. Jackson was born in 1767 and had been through a life that reads more like an action movie than a presidential biography. He had survived smallpox as a kid, duels as a young man, and even major military battles where he should have died. He had several bullet holes and scars that looked like he lived a life that was constantly flirting with death. So by the time he became president in 1829, his body was already weak from all the drama it had been put through, but this didn't stop him from living a full, almost healthy life. In fact, on January 30th, 1835, Jackson almost got assassinated by Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter. The man aimed a pistol at Jackson, but it misfired. So he tried again with a second pistol, which also misfired, and a furious Jackson charged at him with his cane until others could pull Lawrence away. Lawrence was declared insane and institutionalized. Jackson would go on to live well into his 70s, but by this time, he was pretty sick with a strange mix of chronic health issues. Jackson was suffering from dropsy, which was a weird condition that causes liquids to swell in his body. He also suffered from tuberculosis, heart failure, and constant chest pain because there was a bullet lodged in his chest from a duel that never got removed. The bullet caused him lifelong pain and severe coughing fits where he'd even spit up blood. Yet, Jackson refused to die. He kept struggling through the pain and remained president. Throughout his presidency, the man was constantly looking pale, weak, and skinny, but he still managed to run the country, fight political enemies, and live longer than many of his healthier peers. He was so stubbornly tough that people joked he wasn't human, but iron wrapped in flesh. But eventually, the rust on the iron started becoming too hard to ignore. So by the time he reached his last days at the Hermitage, he was basically a medical miracle that had finally run out of steam. What makes his condition so bizarre is that there wasn't really advanced medical care or medications that could manage or help his symptoms. So the man basically survived off sheer will and stubbornness. Sadly, on June 8, 1845, after receiving last rites, he calmly told his family he was ready to go and passed away in his bed. Ulysses S. Grant. When you hear strange presidential deaths, the first thing you'll think of are assassinations, death in battle, or just a freak accident. However, for President Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Civil War hero and the 18th President of the United States, his downfall came from something incredibly ordinary but extremely deadly: cancer. Yeah, the man had cancer of the throat that was caused by his lifelong addiction to cigars. What makes this even worse was that Grant never used to smoke much before. He was a very casual smoker up until his big victory at Fort Donelson in 1862. News outlets reported that he loved cigars, so people started sending him thousands, literally thousands of cigar boxes as gifts. And being the ever-considerate man he was, Grant started puffing away so at least they didn't go to waste. Sometimes he would even chain smoke, like 20 cigars in one day. He slowly turned into an addict from something that was supposed to be a gift of gratitude that ultimately turned into the weapon that killed him. His story actually gets stranger because after leaving office, Grant realized he was in a deep financial mess due to a crooked business partner. However, instead of retreating quietly and dying slowly in his last days, the man decided to write a memoir so his family wouldn't be left in debt and poverty after his death. He spent hours writing obsessively. Doctors, friends, and family members begged him to rest, but the man refused. He wrote feverishly, often while sitting on his porch wrapped in blankets, coughing up blood between paragraphs. Grant was determined to finish, and even though he was unable to eat, barely able to speak, and constantly in pain, he actually finished the memoirs and finally died just 3 days after completing the final pages. The memoir was published after his death and became a massive success and truly saved his family from financial ruin.